Somewhere beneath the frozen soil of the earth, there may be bones, thousands of them, the remains of men who marched under the greatest military banner the ancient world had ever seen, the Roman eagle. Men who were trained to conquer, men who were built to survive, men who simply disappeared. No battle record, no mass grave, no survivor's testimony, no final dispatch sent back to Rome. Just silence, stretching across more than 2,000 years of history. We know their number, we know their name. We even know the general who commanded them. What we do not know, what historians, archaeologists, and military scholars have argued over for centuries, is what happened to them after they crossed into enemy territory and vanished from every known record in the ancient world. This is not a legend. This is not mythology. This is a documented Roman military unit, the Legio IX Hispana, an entire legion of 6,000 trained soldiers who walked into history and never walked back out. The Roman legion was not simply an army unit. It was a civilization in motion. A Roman legion carried with it surgeons, engineers, architects, priests, administrators, and thousands of the most disciplined soldiers the ancient world had ever produced. A legion built roads, constructed bridges, erected fortresses, and crushed kingdoms. Losing one was not just a military disaster. It was a statement, a crack in the armor of an empire that believed itself eternal. And yet, sometime in the early 2nd century A.D., the Ninth Legion, one of Rome's most celebrated and battle-hardened military forces, disappeared from all surviving historical records without a single explanation. There was no announcement of its defeat. No emperor ordered a day of mourning. No defeated general was punished. No poet wrote an elegy. The Ninth Legion simply ceased to exist in the written record, as though someone, or something, had reached into the archives of Rome and quietly erased it. For centuries, this silence was accepted. Empires rise and fall, units are disbanded, records are lost. But then, historians began to look more carefully at the timeline. They began to examine what was happening in the northern edges of the Roman world at the exact moment the Ninth vanished. And what they found was deeply, profoundly unsettling. The mystery of the Ninth Legion is not simply about a missing army. It is about the limits of Roman power, the fury of people who refused to be conquered, and the terrifying possibility that the greatest empire in history was, in at least one dark chapter, completely and utterly defeated, and chose never to speak of it again. To understand what happened to the Ninth Legion, you have to understand what Rome was doing at the edge of its world. By the 1st century A.D., the Roman Empire had consumed most of the known world. Egypt had fallen. Greece was a province. Persia had been pushed back. Spain, Gaul, North Africa, all Roman. The empire's borders stretched across thousands of miles, and at its heart beat a simple, terrifying idea: that Rome was destined to rule everything beneath the sky. Britain was the final great frontier. Julius Caesar had tried to take it twice, in 55 and 54 BC, and both times had been forced to retreat. It was left to the Emperor Claudius, in 43 AD, to finally commit to a full invasion. 4 legions crossed the Channel. Among them was the Legio IX Hispana, the Ninth Legion, nicknamed Hispana, because of its long service in Spain. The Ninth was not a new or untested force. It had fought in the Macedonian Wars, campaigned through the Balkans, served in Africa, and marched across Iberia. By the time it set foot on British soil, it had already been a fighting force for over a century. Its soldiers were professionals, its commanders experienced, its reputation fearsome. For the first few decades, the Roman conquest of Britain proceeded more or less as planned. The southern kingdoms fell. Local tribal leaders either submitted or were crushed. Towns were built, roads were laid, and Roman culture began spreading across the new province like ink on parchment. But Britain was not like anywhere else Rome had conquered. Its terrain was brutal. Dense forests, wild marshlands, rivers that flooded without warning, and hills that seemed to go on forever. And its people, particularly in the north, were something else entirely. They were Celtic warrior tribes who had never been truly domesticated, who fought with a ferocity that even veteran Roman soldiers found unnerving. They were people who painted themselves blue before battle, who worshipped in sacred groves, who believed that death in combat was a door, not an ending. And one of these peoples, in the year 60 AD, came terrifyingly close to ending Roman Britain entirely. Her name was Boudica. Queen of the Iceni tribe, Boudica launched a revolt against Roman rule that became one of the most devastating uprisings in Roman history. Her forces burned Colchester, London, and St. Albans to the ground. They slaughtered an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people, Roman citizens, soldiers, and British collaborators alike, and the Ninth Legion was sent to stop her. They failed, catastrophically. The Ninth marched south to intercept Boudica's army and was caught in open terrain against a force that vastly outnumbered them. The infantry was nearly annihilated. Only the Roman cavalry managed to break away and survive. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of Roman arms. Rome eventually crushed Boudica's revolt through different means, and the governor Paulinus restored order. But the Ninth Legion had been gutted. It was rebuilt, reinforced with fresh troops from the continent and stationed at York, the great northern fortress city the Romans called Eboracum. From there it was expected to hold the line against the tribes of the far north, the tribes the Romans called the Caledonians, the people who would one day become the Scots. And this is where the story darkens. York was not a comfortable posting. The northern frontier of Roman Britain was a place of constant tension, where the empire's reach thinned to almost nothing and the wild, unconquered lands beyond seemed to breathe with menace. The Caledonians had watched Rome consume the south of Britain, and they had no intention of surrendering without a fight. In the years following the Boudican Revolt, Roman Britain experienced a period of relative, fragile stability. The province was rebuilt, its defenses strengthened. The Ninth Legion, now restored to something close to full strength, held the north from its base at York. Then, somewhere between 108 and 120 AD, historians argue about the exact year, the Ninth Legion's name disappears from the official Roman military record. The last confirmed evidence of the Ninth's existence is a construction inscription found at York, dated to approximately 108 AD. The Legion's stamp appears on tiles used in the fortress they were building. After that, nothing, no transfer order, no record of it being posted elsewhere, no account of a battle, no mention of its disbandment. The Ninth Legion simply ceases to appear in any document, any inscription, any record that has survived. The timing is what makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Around this same period, Roman sources hint, vaguely, uncomfortably, at serious trouble on the northern frontier of Britain. One ancient historian wrote of a Roman force being cut to pieces by the enemy in Britain during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. The losses were described as significant enough to require the dispatch of replacement troops from across the empire. And then, of course, there is Hadrian's Wall. In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian himself traveled to Britain and ordered the construction of the most ambitious defensive fortification in the history of the Roman Empire. A stone wall stretching over 70 miles from coast to coast across northern Britain. The official explanation was border control, a manageable boundary, a statement of imperial intent. But historians have long suspected something else. You do not build a wall across an entire country simply to manage trade and immigration. You build a wall like that when something on the other side has frightened you badly enough to seal the border entirely. You build it when the territory beyond has proven too dangerous, too costly, too deadly to hold. Was Hadrian's Wall built partly in response to the destruction of the Ninth Legion? Was it Rome's admission carved in stone and mortar that the north of Britain had won? The evidence is circumstantial, but it is haunting. Over the centuries, scholars have proposed several explanations for the disappearance of the Ninth Legion, and each one carries its own dark weight. The most dramatic theory, and the one that has captured public imagination for over 100 years, is that the Ninth marched north into Caledonian territory on a military campaign and was destroyed, wiped out. 6,000 trained soldiers swallowed by the forests and hills of what is now Scotland, cut down by an enemy they could not see, in terrain they did not know, fighting a people who had chosen to die rather than kneel. There is a historical parallel that makes this theory even more chilling. In 9 AD, 3 full Roman legions were annihilated in the forests of Germany, in what became known as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. 15,000 soldiers massacred in an ambush so complete, so devastating, that the Emperor Augustus reportedly wandered his palace in Rome for days afterward, crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions!" And, crucially, those 3 legion numbers were retired permanently. Rome never used them again. The wound was too deep. If the Ninth Legion was destroyed in battle, Rome's silence might have been deliberate. An empire built on the myth of invincibility could not afford to announce that 6,000 of its finest soldiers had been annihilated by painted warriors in the north of a distant island. So perhaps the records were not lost. Perhaps they were suppressed. But there is a competing theory, and it is far less cinematic, though no less interesting. Some historians argue that the Ninth Legion was not destroyed in Britain at all, but was transferred to another part of the empire and simply lost track of in the surviving record. Ancient records are incomplete. They have been copied, mistranslated, lost, burned, and destroyed across 2 millennia of history. It is entirely possible that the Ninth was sent east to fight in Judea during the Bar-Kokhba Revolt of 132 to 135 AD, and was destroyed or disbanded there, with no surviving source making the connection clear. Archaeological evidence has occasionally surfaced to support this idea. Tile stamps carrying the Ninth Legion's insignia have been found in the Netherlands, dating to possibly the early 2nd century, suggesting the unit may have passed through or been stationed there after leaving Britain. A handful of individual soldiers' grave markers belonging to men of the Ninth have been found as far afield as the Middle East. But these fragments prove only that individual soldiers of the Ninth existed beyond Britain. They do not prove the Legion survived as a unit. They do not explain the silence. A third, darker theory has gained traction in recent decades. What if the Ninth Legion did not vanish due to battle or disbandment, but due to mutiny? Rome's frontier legions occasionally broke under the pressure of impossible conditions. There were cases in Roman history of units refusing orders, of soldiers turning on their commanders, of entire regiments effectively ceasing to function as military entities. Could the Ninth, battered by decades of brutal frontier warfare, have simply collapsed from within? No ancient source supports this directly. But absence of evidence, as any historian will tell you, is not evidence of absence, especially when the empire had every reason to bury an embarrassing truth. Whether the Ninth was destroyed, transferred, or dissolved, the world moved on in the way that empires always do, relentlessly and without sentiment. Hadrian's wall was completed around 128 AD. It stood for nearly 300 years as the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire, garrisoned by other legions, other soldiers, other men from every corner of the known world. The wall was attacked, breached, and repaired multiple times. The Caledonians never stopped pressing against it. Decades after the wall was built, Emperor Antoninus Pius pushed the frontier north again, constructing a second, shorter turf wall across Scotland. But it was abandoned within 20 years. The north proved impossible to hold. Rome's occupation of Britain eventually ended, not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing withdrawal. By the early 5th century, with the empire collapsing in on itself from every direction, The last Roman legions left Britain, never to return. The roads they built remained. The walls they built remained. But the soldiers, the administrators, the civilization, gone. And the Ninth Legion remained missing from the record. No triumphant discovery, no definitive answer. Just the silence that had surrounded it from the beginning. You might wonder why a missing Roman legion matters in the 21st century. 2,000 years have passed. The Roman Empire is dust. The men of the Ninth are dust. What does it matter where they died? It matters because the story of the Ninth Legion is really a story about power, about the seductive illusion of invincibility and the catastrophic cost of its failure. Rome believed it could conquer everything. It had the armies, the engineering, the administrative genius, the cultural weight to bend the entire world to its will. And for centuries it was right. But somewhere in the cold, dark north, it met something it could not overcome. A landscape too wild, a people too fierce, a resistance too stubborn, and the response of the most powerful empire in the world was not to acknowledge the defeat. It was to build a wall, to seal the wound, to pretend in stone and mortar that the unconquerable simply did not need to be conquered. That is not a uniquely Roman failure. That is a human failure, repeated across every civilization in every era. When power meets its limits, the instinct is often to hide the truth rather than face it, to bury the evidence rather than learn from it. 6,000 men marched somewhere and did not come home. They had names, they had families, they had come from Spain and Gaul and Syria and North Africa, from every corner of the ancient world, drawn together by the vast machinery of Roman military service. Some of them were fathers, some were sons, some had never seen snow before they arrived in Britain. Some had spent half their lives on the march and could barely remember the places they had come from. They were real, their disappearance was real, and the fact that history could swallow 6,000 human lives without even leaving behind a record of how or where or why. That is not just a historical puzzle. It is a reminder of how fragile the record of human existence really is, of how much has been lost, of how many stories we will never be able to tell, because the evidence simply is not there. Somewhere, perhaps beneath the peat bogs of Scotland, perhaps beneath the sands of Judea, perhaps beneath the foundations of a city that has been built and rebuilt a dozen times over 20 centuries. The answer might still exist. A grave marker, a scattered collection of Roman military equipment, an inscription on a stone wall that no one has yet thought to translate carefully enough. Or perhaps there is no single answer. Perhaps the truth about the Ninth Legion is not buried in one place, waiting to be discovered, but scattered across the ancient world in fragments too small and too damaged ever to be fully assembled. Perhaps the silence was always the point. Perhaps Rome intended for the Ninth to be forgotten, and even now, 2,000 years later, that intention is holding. What we are left with is the silence itself, and what that silence says about us, about power, about memory, and about the stories we choose to tell and the stories we choose to bury. The Roman Empire lasted for 500 years in the West and 1,000 more in the East. It built roads that are still in use today. It created legal frameworks that underpin modern civilization. It produced art, literature, philosophy, and architecture that still shape the world we live in. And yet somewhere in its vast, meticulous record, there is a gap, a hole in the shape of 6,000 men. The eagle of the Ninth has never been found. The lost legion has never been explained. And in the quiet spaces between the surviving documents, between the inscriptions and the archaeological reports and the academic arguments, 6,000 men are still walking, still marching, their boots on stone roads that no longer exist, their eagle standard raised against a sky that has long since changed beyond recognition. They are going somewhere. They are always going somewhere. And no matter how carefully we search the records, no matter how many stones we turn over, no matter how advanced our technology becomes, they are always somehow just out of reach. That is the nature of true mysteries. Not that they resist answers forever, but that in resisting, they force us to keep looking. And in looking, we find that the question itself is the thing that matters most. The Ninth Legion vanished. Rome eventually fell. But the silence they left behind has outlasted them both, and it is still speaking.